When we talk about Europe screwing Russia, as the headline so colorfully puts it, what we're really discussing is a new phase in a long running geopolitical and economic struggle, one in which economic policy has become the battlefield. Europe is moving to shift its energy systems away from Russian supply chains, not only to punish Russia for its geopolitical actions, but also to create a more self sufficient economic structure. And here's the part many people don't expect: Europe's strategy isn't just sanctions, embargoes, or shutting pipelines. It's the accelerated restructuring of its entire energy market, new trade partnerships, massive investments in renewables, and a deliberate re engineering of dependence. This is not simply political posturing. It is economic transformation driven by an attempt to outmaneuver an adversary by reshaping the very foundations of European production and consumption. Europe's accelerating break from Russian energy is not just a policy shift, it is one of the most dramatic economic pivots in modern geopolitical history, a move that is unfolding with a speed and determination few expected even a few years ago. What makes this transformation so striking is not merely the political motivation behind it, but the scale of the restructuring underway. For decades, Europe built its industrial backbone, its heating systems, and a significant portion of its economic stability on a steady flow of Russian oil and natural gas. That dependency was large, entrenched, and seemed, until recently, nearly impossible to unwind. Yet today, Europe is engaged in a near historic effort to sever those ties, and it is doing so with a mix of urgency, strategy, and long term ambition that signals a permanent shift rather than a temporary reaction. And the most surprising part: Europe appears prepared to endure major short term pain to achieve long term independence, a willingness that dramatically reshapes the global energy landscape. The hook here is that many observers believed Europe would never willingly cut itself off from Russian energy, as the economic costs appeared too high and the alternatives too uncertain. But the continent has proven that what was once considered politically unthinkable becomes possible when strategic vulnerability becomes too dangerous to ignore. Europe isn't simply replacing Russian barrels with new suppliers. It is attempting to eliminate geopolitical leverage by transforming the structure of its entire energy system. This is a move driven as much by the fear of future coercion as by the consequences of past aggression. And understanding this context explains why the shift has been so rapid and resolute. The most immediate expression of this acceleration is the diversification of natural gas sources. Europe has aggressively expanded import deals with nations such as Norway, Qatar, the United States, and Algeria, redirecting billions of euros into long-term LNG contracts and infrastructure expansions. New liquefied natural gas terminals are being constructed at a pace that would have been unthinkable just 5 years ago. Floating storage units, emergency pipelines, and strategic storage facilities have become central pillars of Europe's transition strategy. This scramble for diversification is not a temporary patchwork. It represents a new architecture of energy flow that will define the continent's future. The message is unmistakable: Russia will no longer be allowed to hold a monopoly on Europe's energy stability. What makes this acceleration even more consequential is that it has forced Europe to confront uncomfortable truths about its reliance on fossil fuels more broadly. In cutting off Russian supplies, European leaders have had to rethink not just who supplies their energy, but what kind of energy they want to rely on. This is where renewable power enters the story in a transformative way. Wind, solar, hydrogen, and green industrial technologies have become more than climate initiatives. They are geopolitical tools. By reducing dependence on traditional fuel sources, Europe is also reducing the possibility of future vulnerability. Renewable energy, once viewed primarily as an environmental priority, has now become an instrument of political insulation. And this shift in framing has unlocked political will and public support that previously struggled to overcome the inertia of legacy systems. Another critical element behind Europe's accelerated break from Russian supply is the recognition that energy dependency is also economic dependency. The continent has long understood that reliance on Russian gas created an economic imbalance that gave Russia disproportionate leverage over European markets. Price shocks, supply manipulation, and sudden disruptions all carried enormous economic consequences. The current push to restructure the energy system is a direct attempt to eliminate those structural risks. By diversifying sources and expanding renewable capacity, Europe is attempting to build an economy that cannot be destabilized by external political decisions. The notion is simple but powerful. An independent energy system is the foundation of economic sovereignty. The momentum behind this shift is also supported by a broader recognition among European policymakers that the transition offers opportunities for industrial renewal. The race to build renewable technologies, produce clean hydrogen, and modernize manufacturing presents economic potential that aligns with political necessity. This is where the break from Russian energy becomes more than a defensive move. It becomes an offensive strategy for long-term competitiveness. European nations are using this moment to attract investment, foster innovation, and position themselves as leaders in the global energy transition. In doing so, they are not merely escaping a dependency, they are capitalizing on an opportunity. What makes Europe's acceleration truly compelling is how quickly public sentiment has evolved in support of this change. A population once wary of high energy prices has accepted that short-term hardships may be necessary for long-term stability and autonomy. This shift in public willingness has emboldened governments to take more decisive actions, creating a feedback loop that reinforces momentum. The break from Russian energy is no longer framed solely as a penalty against Russia. It is framed as an act of self-protection, economic modernization, and strategic empowerment. Europe's rapid departure from dependence on Russian energy is not just a reaction to geopolitical events, it is a reshaping of the continent's economic DNA. And the world is watching because Europe's willingness to absorb immediate challenges in pursuit of long-term independence sets a precedent that could redefine the future of global energy politics. Europe's massive investments in renewable energy are not simply an environmental strategy. They are a geopolitical calculation, an economic overhaul, and a declaration of independence all rolled into one. What makes this moment so compelling is that Europe is not just adding renewables to its portfolio, it is leveraging them as a direct instrument of power in a global struggle shaped by energy dependency. The scale of this shift is breathtaking, and the speed is unprecedented. Europe is pouring hundreds of billions of euros into solar fields, offshore wind megaprojects, hydrogen hubs, and next-generation nuclear technology, transforming its energy system faster than most analysts ever thought politically or logistically possible. The surprising, and for many shocking, truth is that Europe is building an energy structure that could render fossil fuel leverage, particularly from Russia, nearly irrelevant. And that is where the story becomes even more dramatic. Here's the hook. Europe's clean energy revolution is not being driven primarily by environmental activism anymore. It is being driven by political fear, fear of vulnerability, fear of coercion, and fear of the economic instability that comes from relying on a geopolitical rival for the fuel that powers your economy. When energy becomes a weapon, nations start treating energy independence as a matter of survival. That is exactly what Europe is doing. And it is doing so with an urgency that reveals just how deeply the old ties to Russian energy were woven into the continent's economic fabric. At the heart of Europe's strategy is a simple but powerful idea. If renewable energy is produced domestically, it cannot be weaponized by foreign suppliers. This is why countries like Germany, France, Spain, and the Netherlands are investing heavily in offshore wind farms capable of powering millions of homes. It is why solar capacity is doubling and tripling in regions where just a decade ago, solar energy was considered too expensive or too inconsistent to provide reliable power. The economics have changed, the technology has matured, and the political incentives have crystallized into a singular mission to build an energy ecosystem that Europe controls entirely. But what makes these investments especially consequential is that they are not limited to renewables themselves. Europe is building a whole new industrial ecosystem around them. Take hydrogen, for example. Europe is betting big on green hydrogen as the fuel of the future, aiming to replace natural gas in industries that cannot easily electrify. This includes steel production, chemical manufacturing, and heavy transport sectors, industries that traditionally relied heavily on Russian gas. By investing in hydrogen, Europe is betting not only on clean energy, but also on industrial reinvention. The hope is that these technologies will not only free Europe from geopolitical dependencies, but also position it as a global leader in next generation manufacturing. Another hook is the sheer degree of coordination required to make this transformation possible. Renewable energy is not just about solar panels and wind turbines. It requires massive upgrades to grids, new storage technologies, and sophisticated digital management systems. Europe is essentially rebuilding its energy infrastructure from the ground up, and it is doing this while maintaining stability in power supply, an extraordinary challenge that most of the public does not see. Behind the scenes, engineers, policymakers, and private sector investors are orchestrating one of the most complex energy transitions in modern economic history. The investments are also reshaping Europe's political relationships by partnering with countries like Norway for electricity interconnectors, North African nations for solar to hydrogen projects, and the United States for advanced renewable technologies. Europe is forging a new network of energy alliances. These partnerships are designed to reduce reliance on Russia, but they also reflect a broader strategic ambition. Europe wants to be at the center of the global clean energy supply chain, not merely a consumer of it. Europe's commitment to renewables is also transforming its internal politics. Governments are no longer just debating climate goals. They are competing to attract renewable energy industries and secure leadership positions in the emerging green tech economy. Nations are offering subsidies, streamlined permitting processes, and industrial policy incentives to accelerate development. This competition is driving innovation and pushing Europe to the forefront of global renewable energy deployment. Perhaps the most surprising part of this entire shift is the growing public support behind it. Europeans who once worried about the cost of the renewable transition have become more receptive to ambitious investments because they now understand the geopolitical stakes, high energy prices, inflationary pressures, and supply disruptions have reframed renewable energy from a green luxury to a strategic necessity. This shift in public sentiment has empowered governments to take bolder, faster actions than previously imaginable. Europe's massive investment in renewable energy is therefore not simply a climate initiative, it is a strategic gambit designed to reshape the continent's economic and political future. It signals a new era in which energy independence, industrial competitiveness, and geopolitical strength are all tied directly to the success of renewable transformation. And as Europe continues to accelerate its clean energy investments, the world is being forced to watch and prepare for an entirely new global energy order. Russia's struggle to find viable alternative markets after losing Europe as its dominant energy customer is one of the most discussed yet deeply consequential developments in global politics. The shift is not just an economic inconvenience for Moscow, it is a structural blow that reshapes Russia's long-term economic trajectory. For decades, Europe served as Russia's most lucrative and strategically dependable buyer, purchasing huge volumes of natural gas and oil at prices that helped sustain Russia's federal budget, stabilize its currency, and fund its broader geopolitical ambitions. Now, almost overnight in historical terms, that market has evaporated, and the shock is far deeper than many observers initially recognized. The hook here is simple. Russia's ability to replace Europe is far more limited than official narratives suggest, and the alternatives come with strings attached that Moscow cannot easily escape. When Europe swiftly redirected its energy imports away from Russia, many analysts expected Russia to effortlessly pivot toward Asia, particularly China and India. After all, these nations have large economies, growing energy demand, and diplomatic relationships with Moscow that might allow for long-term cooperation. But the reality is far more complicated. Europe was not just any customer, it was the highest paying, most stable, and most infrastructure compatible market Russia had. Pipelines were built specifically for Europe. Pricing formulas were long established. Political agreements were predictable. Replacing that level of integration is not just difficult, in many ways, it is structurally impossible to replicate. And that's where Russia's challenges begin to deepen. China, often portrayed as Russia's natural replacement for Europe, plays a far more calculated game. Yes, Beijing is buying more Russian oil and gas than before, but it is doing so at steep discounts. China understands that Russia has few alternatives, and it uses that leverage to negotiate prices that are significantly below global market rates. The power dynamic has shifted dramatically. Where Europe once depended on Russia, Russia now depends on China, and China knows it. Moreover, the infrastructure bottleneck is severe. Only one major gas pipeline currently connects Russia to China, and expanding this network will take years, cost billions, and require Beijing's cooperation. Even then, the projected capacity will not come close to replacing the volumes Russia once shipped to Europe. India presents another layer of complexity. New Delhi has taken advantage of discounted Russian oil, refining it and then exporting fuel products to global markets. But India is not making the kind of long-term commitments that Europe once provided. Its purchases are tactical and price-driven, with no guarantee of consistency. Russia has found buyers, yes, but not partners. That distinction matters profoundly in energy markets where stability often matters as much as price. The hook here is that Russia's alternative markets are not built on mutual dependence but on opportunism, and opportunistic buyers have no reason to offer favorable terms. The logistical constraints further complicate Russia's pivot. Shipping oil across longer distances requires more tankers, more insurance, and more risk exposure. Many of the tankers used are part of what observers call the shadow fleet, vessels operating under opaque ownership structures to circumvent sanctions. These ships face higher operating costs, safety risks, and legal uncertainties. And even with these ships in play, Russia cannot redirect all the volumes it once sold to Europe. Natural gas, in particular, poses the biggest challenge. Unlike oil, which can be transported by sea, pipeline gas cannot be rerouted without major infrastructure projects. Europe's decision to replace Russian gas with LNG and other sources essentially stranded Russia's pipeline network, leaving enormous infrastructure investments underutilized. But perhaps the most significant consequence is the impact on Russia's long term economic stability. Energy exports account for a large share of Russia's government revenue. Losing Europe means losing premium prices, predictable demand, and strategic leverage. The discounted sales to Asia may keep revenue flowing in the short term, but they cannot compensate for the structural loss of Europe. This is why Russia faces growing budget pressures, currency volatility, and reduced fiscal flexibility. The energy sector, once the foundation of Russia's geopolitical power, is shifting into a position of dependency on a handful of price sensitive buyers. What makes this moment even more pivotal is that global markets are changing as the world accelerates toward renewable energy and decarbonization. The demand for oil and gas is expected to plateau and eventually decline. Russia is pivoting to new markets at the very moment those markets are preparing to move beyond fossil fuels. This means Russia is fighting not only geopolitical headwinds, but also long term economic trends that limit its ability to rely on hydrocarbon exports indefinitely. The clock is ticking, and the window for adaptation is narrowing. The story, therefore, is not simply that Russia lost Europe. It is that Russia lost the only energy customer that offered stability, profitability, and long term strategic alignment. The alternatives are scattered, opportunistic, and deeply asymmetrical in power. And as Russia tries to rebuild its energy future through these new partnerships, it finds itself operating from a position of vulnerability rather than strength, a reversal few anticipated, but one that may shape global politics for years to come. Russia's attempt to replace Europe as its primary energy customer is one of the most revealing tests of its economic resilience and one of the most misunderstood. For years, Europe wasn't just a big buyer of Russian oil and gas. It was the buyer that paid the highest prices, honored long-term contracts, and built infrastructure that locked both sides into a stable, mutually beneficial arrangement. That stability gave the Kremlin predictable revenue, political leverage, and the confidence to use energy as a geopolitical tool. But once Europe rapidly dismantled its dependency, Russia found itself scrambling for alternatives in a world where no replacement market comes close in value, reliability, or strategic compatibility. And here's the hook: almost everything Russia is doing now is a defensive improvisation, not a structured long-term plan, because the kind of market Europe represented simply doesn't exist anywhere else. The first part of Russia's struggle begins with China. On paper, China seems like the perfect replacement: massive energy demand, a willingness to strengthen ties with Moscow, and an existing gas pipeline connecting the two nations. But the reality is far more lopsided. China knows Russia is operating from weakness, and Beijing is capitalizing on that fact ruthlessly. It buys Russian oil at heavy discounts, demands pricing terms far below global benchmarks, and signs deals only when they serve China's economic advantage. Unlike Europe, which committed to decades of interdependence through long-term contracts, China refuses to put itself in a position of dependency. Russia is not negotiating with a partner, it's negotiating with a buyer that holds nearly all the leverage. The hook here is stark. Russia has shifted from a position of power to a position of concession, and China is extracting every ounce of advantage from that change. The infrastructure mismatch deepens the challenge. Russia spent decades building pipelines, storage networks, and transit systems designed specifically for European markets. Natural gas flowed effortlessly through Nord Stream, Yamal, and Ukrainian routes directly into European industrial hubs. Those pipelines cannot simply be rerouted to Asia. To expand gas exports eastward, Russia would need to build massive new pipelines like the proposed Power of Siberia 2, but China dictates the timeline, the conditions, and the price. This is not an equal partnership. This is China waiting until Russia becomes desperate enough to accept whatever terms Beijing eventually offers. Europe gave Russia leverage. China strips it away. Then there is India, a nation that has increasingly bought more Russian oil, but with a strategy rooted entirely in opportunism. India buys Russian crude only because it's discounted. It refines that crude into gasoline and diesel, then resells those fuels on the global market at full price. India is not functioning as a long-term customer, but as a savvy arbitrage player. If global dynamics shift, if prices move, if discounts narrow, India can walk away in an instant. Europe never operated like this. It made structural commitments, built long-term pipelines, and locked in multi-decade contracts. Russia lost not just a buyer, but a system of economic predictability, and no new market is willing to replicate that. Russia's logistical problems intensify the crisis. Reaching Asian markets requires tankers, and many of Russia's shipments rely on a shadow fleet, aging vessels with obscure ownership and high insurance risks. These ships face sanctions pressure, safety vulnerabilities, and heightened transport costs. Longer travel distances also mean slower turnover and greater exposure to maritime disruption. And gas, even more challenging than oil, cannot be shipped in meaningful volumes without LNG terminals and specialized carriers. Infrastructure Russia lacks on a competitive scale. Beyond the logistics, the financial impact is profound. Energy exports make up a huge share of Russia's federal revenue. Europe paid premium prices, Asia pays bargain rates. The Kremlin can still move barrels. Yes, but it earns far less for them. As revenue shrinks, budget deficits grow. The ruble becomes more volatile. Social spending pressures rise, and the government is forced to rely more heavily on reserves and domestic taxation. This is not merely a short-term squeeze. It is a structural decline in Russia's economic power. What makes this situation even more striking is its timing. The world is transitioning away from fossil fuels. Europe is racing into renewables. China is electrifying transportation and expanding nuclear power. India is diversifying aggressively. Global demand for oil and gas will not disappear overnight, but long-term projections are not in Russia's favor. Russia is trying to rebuild its energy export model at the exact moment when the global market is slowly but steadily moving beyond the commodity Russia depends on most. The window for adaptation is shrinking, and Russia is moving in the wrong direction. The uncomfortable truth is that Russia hasn't pivoted to Asia. It has retreated there. It didn't choose these markets. It was pushed toward them after losing the only one that offered stability, wealth, and predictable geopolitical returns. Europe's departure didn't simply reduce Russia's profits, it removed the foundation of Russia's modern economic structure. The alternatives are fragmented, conditional, and dependent on buyers who hold all the leverage. That is the real story behind Russia's struggle to find new markets. A major energy power is navigating a world where its strengths no longer guarantee influence, and where economics, not politics, are determining the limits of its future. Europe's embrace of heavy state intervention in its energy and economic systems is one of the most striking reversals of modern economic ideology, a pivot that reveals just how quickly the so-called free market can be pushed aside when political survival and economic stability are on the line. For decades, Europe preached the virtues of deregulation, privatization, and market-driven efficiency. Governments stepped back, markets stepped forward, and the private sector was framed as the engine of growth. But the moment energy became a geopolitical weapon, that ideology cracked. Europe pivoted almost instantly toward large-scale planning, coordinated policy action, and state-backed market restructuring. And here's the hook. This shift didn't happen gradually or reluctantly. It happened almost overnight, exposing a truth economists have long debated, but politicians often avoid admitting. When crises hit, it is not markets that save governments. It is governments that save markets. The energy crisis forced Europe to confront a hard reality. Markets do not naturally create resilience. They create profit, often at the cost of vulnerability. For years, European governments allowed private energy companies to lean heavily on cheap Russian gas because it was efficient, cost effective, and profitable. There was no strategic redundancy built into the system because redundancy is expensive and markets avoid expense unless forced. Once that system collapsed, Europe discovered it had no choice but to intervene dramatically. Price caps on electricity and gas, subsidies for households, strategic gas reserves, new regulations on energy traders, and emergency reforms of electricity pricing mechanisms became standard practice, moves that would have been politically unthinkable a decade earlier. Yet they were adopted almost without hesitation. What makes this interventionist turn so compelling is not just the scale of government action, but the type of action being taken. Europe is no longer merely regulating markets, it is actively steering them. Entire sectors are being redirected through subsidies, industrial policies, public investment, and coordinated procurement strategies. This is not laissez-faire capitalism, it is planned capitalism. And the hook here is that Europe isn't hiding it. Officials openly acknowledge that the private sector cannot deliver the level of energy security or structural transformation required under conditions of geopolitical threat. Governments are now picking winners, guiding investments, and shaping market behavior. The ideology of the free market has been replaced with the practicality of state-led strategy. Consider the electricity market reforms. Europe is redesigning the way electricity prices are set so consumers are no longer vulnerable to gas market spikes. That means altering the fundamental rules of the energy market, a level of intervention reminiscent of post-war reconstruction. These reforms are not temporary bandages, they are structural rewrites that will define how energy markets operate for decades. The lesson is clear. Europe has recognized that markets left alone optimize for profit, not resilience, and resilience is now the priority. Then there is the massive expansion of subsidies for energy producers, industrial companies, and households. Europe has committed hundreds of billions of euros to soften the impact of price shocks, support low-income families, prevent business closures, and ensure grid reliability. These are not minor interventions. They are direct government participation in economic life on a scale unseen since the 1970s, and yet, unlike the debates of the past, there is little political hesitation because leaders know the alternative, allowing markets to run freely during a crisis, would result in social unrest, widespread industrial collapse, and deeper geopolitical vulnerability. Another striking dimension of Europe's shift is the revival of industrial policy. Industries that once operated under pure market conditions, steel, chemicals, automotive, and manufacturing, are now receiving state-backed incentives to transition toward new energy systems. Governments are not merely reacting to crisis, they are shaping the future architecture of the economy. This is the kind of long-term planning that free market ideology typically discourages. But under pressure, Europe has rediscovered something that economists like Richard Wolff often highlight. Even advanced capitalist economies rely on planning far more than they publicly admit. Perhaps the most revealing aspect of Europe's embrace of intervention is the changing public attitude. Citizens who once resisted government involvement in markets now expect it. Energy bills became a political battlefield, and voters demanded stability, something markets cannot guarantee. The public accepted price caps, subsidies, and government led investments because the alternative was untenable. And this acceptance has given governments the political mandate to take control of markets in ways that once would have triggered intense ideological backlash. This shift also underscores a deeper truth crisis, exposed the limits of economic theory. Free market ideology works smoothly only in stable conditions where shocks are absent and supply chains are predictable. But in a world of pandemics, wars, climate volatility, and geopolitical fragmentation, stability is no longer a given. Planning becomes not just an option, but a requirement. Europe is simply acknowledging that reality and acting on it faster and more decisively than almost anyone expected. What is emerging now is a hybrid economic model, one where markets still operate, but within parameters shaped and enforced by the state to ensure resilience, independence, and long-term strategic security. Europe is proving that when national survival is at stake, ideology bends and practicality takes over. And in doing so, it is redefining what economic governance looks like in an era of uncertainty. Europe's shift away from Russian energy is reshaping global energy prices in ways that few policymakers fully anticipated and even fewer can control. What makes this moment extraordinary is that Europe, long seen as a predictable and stable energy consumer, has suddenly become one of the most aggressive actors in the global energy market. The consequences are reverberating across continents. Prices that once moved with steady seasonal rhythms now swing unpredictably, driven by Europe's urgent need to secure new supplies, build new infrastructure, and rewrite the rules of its energy system. And here's the hook. Europe didn't just disrupt its own market, it disrupted everyone's. A continent-wide pivot of this magnitude doesn't happen quietly. It shakes the global pricing structure from the ground up. For decades, global energy markets functioned on a foundation of predictability. Europe bought large volumes of Russian gas through pipelines, often under long-term contracts governed by stable pricing mechanisms. That stability rippled outward, influencing LNG markets, oil trade patterns, and regional pricing dynamics across Asia, the Middle East, and North America. Once that system fractured, the shockwaves were immediate. Europe, that suddenly cut off from its primary supplier, entered the global LNG market with unprecedented intensity. Countries that once relied on steady LNG deliveries found themselves outbid by European buyers willing to pay whatever was necessary to keep their economies running. That desperation pricing became one of the most powerful forces reshaping the global market. What makes this dynamic so compelling is that Europe didn't just buy more LNG, it changed how LNG is priced. Instead of predictable, contract-based purchasing, Europe moved towards spot market buying, which is inherently volatile. Spot prices can swing wildly based on weather, geopolitical events, or supply disruptions. By shifting toward the spot market, Europe injected instability directly into the global energy bloodstream. Asian countries, accustomed to predictable LNG shipments, suddenly faced unexpected shortages or skyrocketing prices. Emerging economies found themselves priced out altogether. Global competition intensified, and the predictable patterns that once guided investment and planning dissolved in a matter of months. The hook here is that Europe's search for energy security has unintentionally created energy insecurity elsewhere. When Europe offers a premium for LNG cargoes, suppliers divert shipments away from other regions. Markets that once took affordability for granted now face the harsh reality of competing with one of the world's wealthiest blocs. The ripple effect impacts electricity prices, industrial costs, and even inflation rates in distant countries. Europe's pivot has become a global economic event with local consequences felt in homes, factories, and supply chains far outside its borders. But Europe's moves also reshape long term pricing expectations. Investors now see Europe as a major long term player in global LNG markets, which encourages producers to scale up export capacity. That might sound positive, but it creates a paradox. Short term prices rise due to tight competition, while long term price expectations fall as new supply eventually comes online. This dual dynamic makes planning extremely difficult for both exporters and importers, leading to a more unstable investment environment. Producers must navigate a world where they face immediate profits but long term uncertainty. Consumers must prepare for the possibility of prolonged price volatility, even as new capacity promises eventual relief. Europe's massive investment in renewable energy also complicates global pricing. As Europe scales up wind, solar, hydrogen, and storage technologies, it reduces long term demand for fossil fuels. That projected decline influences futures markets and long term investment decisions across the globe. Energy traders and producers must now factor in the reality that Europe, once one of the world's most dependable fossil fuel customers, is moving aggressively toward independence. This creates price fluctuations based on future expectations, not just present conditions. At the same time, Europe's shift has amplified the importance of geopolitical events. A pipeline explosion, a port disruption, or a supply interruption that once caused mild market ripples can now trigger global price spikes. Markets have become hyper reactive because the margins for flexibility are so thin. Europe has consumed much of the world's spare LNG capacity, leaving little room for error. A single winter storm or heat wave in Europe can now drive price shocks across Asia and Latin America. The world is learning in real time how interconnected energy markets truly are and how vulnerable they become when a major player overhauls its energy strategy overnight. The most revealing element of all is the way Europe's actions are forcing other nations to rethink their own energy plans. Countries that once relied on imported LNG are scrambling to build more renewables. Nations planning new gas infrastructure are now reconsidering their timelines. Energy security is being reframed around diversification, flexibility, and resilience. Because the old reliance on predictable trade flows has been shattered. Europe's departure from Russian energy has not just changed prices, it has changed behaviors, expectations, and the very architecture of global energy markets. The world is now operating in a more competitive, more volatile, and more politically entangled energy landscape. One reshaped not by gradual evolution, but by Europe's sudden and sweeping break from its past. Europe's strategy toward Russia is often described as a series of sanctions, embargoes, and diplomatic maneuvers. But the deeper truth, the one that's easy to miss if you only look at headlines, is that Europe isn't just responding to Russia's actions. It's redesigning its entire energy and economic framework in ways that could permanently shift the balance of power on the continent. This is not simply retaliation. This is a long-term structural move to ensure that Russia can never again use energy as leverage over Europe. And here's the hook. This isn't about punishing Russia today. It's about rendering Russia's biggest geopolitical weapon useless tomorrow. For decades, Russia's influence in Europe rested on a single, powerful foundation: energy dependency. As long as Europe needed Russian gas to heat homes, run industries, and stabilize electricity grids, Moscow held a kind of silent leverage that shaped political decisions across the continent. That leverage kept sanctions limited, kept diplomatic pressure restrained, and created a subtle but unmistakable sense that Europe could only push Russia so far. Russia knew it, Europe knew it, and the entire geopolitical relationship operated around that unspoken reality. What makes Europe's current shift so monumental is that it aims to eliminate that structural vulnerability once and for all. Europe's move is fundamentally strategic. By rapidly building new energy partnerships, investing in domestic production, and diversifying supply routes, it's crafting a future in which Russia has no meaningful hold on European policy. This is not the short-term pain of sanctions, it's the long-term dismantling of a dependency that shaped decades of geopolitical balance. The hook is that the real impact isn't being felt today, it's being baked into the future. 10 years from now, Europe will be operating in a system Russia can't manipulate, influence, or disrupt. One of the most powerful tools Europe is using in this shift is the massive re-engineering of its energy market. Rather than simply replacing Russian gas with gas from somewhere else, Europe is reducing its overall reliance on natural gas itself. This includes expansions in renewables, electrification of industry, and investments in technologies that minimize fuel-based energy demand altogether. Every solar field built, every wind farm expanded, every hydrogen project funded reduces the future space Russia occupies in Europe's energy portfolio. That's not just diversification, it's displacement. What makes this displacement so strategically effective is how it changes Russia's future bargaining power. Even if geopolitical tensions eased, even if Europe wanted to renew imports, Russia would no longer be indispensable. That loss of indispensability is the real geopolitical blow. It doesn't matter if Russia can still sell energy elsewhere. It matters that Europe will no longer be coerced by the threat of what happens if Russia turns off the tap. Removing that threat rewrites the rules of engagement between the two powers. Europe's long-term strategy is also reshaping its industrial future. By moving away from Russian energy, Europe is using the moment to drive investment into new technologies that don't just replace fossil fuels, they create entirely new industries. Clean hydrogen, advanced energy storage, large-scale battery manufacturing, next-generation nuclear designs, and electric grid modernization are becoming central pillars of Europe's industrial evolution. And the hook here is that Europe isn't just detaching from Russia, it's strengthening itself. It is turning a geopolitical crisis into an economic transformation that positions the continent more competitively for the next global energy era. What's equally striking is how Europe's shift is influencing global alliances. Without the need for Russian energy, Europe can pursue foreign policy with more confidence and less hesitation. Decisions that once felt risky, military support, diplomatic pressure, economic restrictions, now feel more feasible because the structural vulnerability is fading. Europe can act not from caution, but from strategy. That's a level of freedom the continent has not had in decades. This new freedom is precisely why Europe's long-term strategy matters more than any single sanction or policy decision. It rewrites the power relationship entirely. Instead of a Europe forced into careful balance, we may see a Europe willing to challenge Russia more openly, invest in stronger alliances, and expand its role in global security. For Russia, this means losing not just Europe's money, but Europe's hesitation, a far more consequential loss. Another layer often overlooked is how public sentiment plays into this shift. European citizens, having witnessed firsthand the risks of energy dependency, now overwhelmingly support energy diversification, renewable expansion, and reduced ties to Russia. That public mandate gives European governments the political cover to pursue long-term strategies they once avoided. It's rare for a geopolitical shift to gain this level of public endorsement, and that endorsement makes the changes far more durable. In the end, Europe's strategy is not about today's headlines or tomorrow's market fluctuations. It's about designing a future where Russia's primary leverage point disappears. It's about building systems that Russia cannot disrupt and forming alliances that Russia cannot easily fracture. And the hook, the part that will surprise many when they look back, is that Europe didn't win by confronting Russia head on. It won by quietly removing the foundations of Russia's influence piece by piece until the structure simply couldn't stand anymore. In closing, what we are watching is not simply Europe versus Russia. We are witnessing the global economic order reshaping itself, nations reorganizing supply chains, industries revising their operations, and governments rediscovering the reality that economic planning is not an ideological choice but a practical necessity. The decisions made today will reverberate for years, not only across Europe and Russia, but throughout the global economy. And as always, the real question we must ask is not only what governments are doing, but who ultimately benefits and who pays the price when economic systems are rewritten under pressure. That is the conversation we must continue to have openly, honestly, and with the economic clarity the moment demands.